And settling into the posture we've chosen for our body to reside. Without any demand or force, we remember that we have a body. And we can see how effortless it is to feel the body just with that ordinary remembering. Our hearts know how to be sensitive. We know how to be intimate, to tune in, to listen, to feel. So mindfulness is less of a thing that we need to do. It's not a job. It's something that comes naturally. When we can remember to value intimacy, and we may have to remember again and again, oh yeah, I value being intentional. I value awareness. I value sensitivity. And that helps us connect and linger right here in and with the body. We might even say that mindfulness or awareness is an embodied awareness, embodied mindfulness, embodied sensitivity. Because everything happens right here. We only know and experience the world, our hearts, through this body. Sight happens right here where the eyes take in light. We experience sounds right here at the ear door. And if we look, most of the time, even though it might go without our noticing, emotions, thoughts can be felt right here too. So if we want to get close to ourselves, We want to know who we are so that we can cultivate skillful habits. And we stay really attuned to the body. Experience comes and goes as we attune to the body. We can trust that nothing lingers forever. Everything is moving. And although it may not feel this way, nothing is personal either. Every experience is here lawfully, a result of history, causes and conditions that have supported its arising. Nothing's personal. Our job is to care, to feel, to not resist. There's no reason to be in contention with experience, with life itself. Everything is moving, nothing is personal. So let's continue in silence now. Take a minute to stretch your legs if you'd like. If you're on Zoom, you can step away from your camera for a minute if you'd like to. Well, once again, it's good to see you all here. Nice to be here on a Sunday morning again. I'm subbing for Mark this morning while he's away leading a retreat with Kamala Masters at Cloud Mountain. He'll be back next week though. And this, if you've been around a while, you might know that every quarter we often do we call a Precepts and Refuges ceremony. And what that means is just that we talk about it and understand maybe what it's all about, to take the refuges into our heart and to take up some ethical trainings that we might call working with or training with the precepts. And so we're on that Sunday now. So I'll do a little bit of, I'll share a little bit of my own reflections about the refuges and precepts. And then if we want to, hopefully if there's time for it, we can chant them at the end of the program. And so I'll just begin by saying, sometimes I think this refuges and precepts ceremony can be misunderstood like we're, I don't know, following someone else's plan for us, or following rules or something like that. And it's really not meant to be that way, and at least in my understanding. The understanding the refuges or what it might mean to take refuge, you know, we don't even have to be a Buddhist for that. These are just kind of pragmatic offerings from the Buddha, right? That we learn how to honor our intentionality in life, and we're all here for similar reasons. Maybe if we took a poll in the room, we would see some differences among us, but we want to live skillfully. We want to be there for our friends and family. We want to be in our lives. We want to be courageous in the midst of anything, right? And we want to learn how to navigate the heart sensitivity so that we don't have to just, just avoid anything that's hard or look forward to the next vacation, right? We want to just be in our lives, right? And so if we think about taking refuge in a broad way, it's about honoring this intentionality that we're all living with. And it's for each of us to decide how that makes sense for us in our own lives, given the conditions of our lives. And that's the take-home point for today. If you don't really hear anything else, and if you're kind of like, I don't know about this, or I don't know about that, just remember, this is for each of us to go and see for ourselves how it makes sense. And we're all going to follow some plan, if you will. Maybe plan's not the best word, but something will shape our lives, right? We'll need something to orient our lives around. And so the refuges and precepts is a good way to orient our lives around some intentionality and give us some ethical guidance. That's what they're here for. And they really become relevant to us when we start to value living in this intentional way and tuning into ourselves. And not just so that we understand ourselves better, but that's a part of it, but also so that we can see how interconnected all things really are and how we are to one another. It helps us live in better harmony with each other. And sometimes our suffering brings us here, right, to our willingness to explore what it means to live intentionally or what it means to take up an ethical framework. Sometimes, for a lot of us, for maybe most of us, if not all of us, some kind of suffering has brought us to this practice, right? Not if you're with me on that one, right? Yeah. So we have to honor where we're at and apply these trainings to where they make sense or not in our lives, not in someone else's. And in both cases, the refuges and the precepts, to me, I think of them as renewing energies, because we're deluded human beings, right? The Buddhist teachings are for deluded human beings. And in our delusion, we forget what's important all the time, right? We just get off on some autopilot mode and start doing things, and without remembering, where our values are and why we hold them dearly and what might shape our actions and our interactions. So a regular recitation like this that we do at Common Ground every quarter, sometimes people do this daily. I do it daily, not always formally, but often with just a few minutes to remember, like, okay, what do you want to guide your life today, sweetie? Do you want it to be just reactivity and whatever happens, happens? Or do you want to have some framework, some orientation for which to go about how you do things? And I always choose the latter, right? When I remember to connect in that way. And often if you've been on a retreat, the refuges and precepts are something that we take into our hearts at the beginning of an intentional period, like a retreat. But we can consider our lives our own retreat, a different version of a retreat, right? And so taking these refuges and precepts into our hearts as often as we can, just for a moment, remembering, or in a more formal way, like we might, if we have time for, do this morning, then it can really change the satisfaction we have in how we live, right? So they're in the chant book if you want to look at them, and I'm gonna paste them into the chat also. A link to a document in the chat for you now. So taking refuge often begins with this statement, Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Right, that's the Pali, the language that was spoken, or the language that the teachings were written down in. After the death of the Buddha, nothing was written down for 400 years, which to me might seem like, right? But it's actually such a beautiful reminder that people cared so much about these teachings that they carried them forward orally for 400 years. Page 22? Page 22, if you're looking for it. Got it? 35, 22 or 35. So this Namo Tassa statement is an acknowledgement of our teacher, and how our teacher, the Buddha, where these teachings came from, how he came to understand suffering. And that suffering is a result of taking things personally, things that aren't personal, right? And this is a difficult concept or difficult teaching for our systems to grok, because everything seems to be, oriented around I am, and this is me. And yet when we look, we start to see that might not be so. Actually, that isn't so. And we start to see that in really, sometimes very simple ways. Like we notice, like, wow, anxiety just seems to come on when the conditions are right for that. Doesn't seem to be who I am. And I'm not the only one with anxiety. Look at that. And wow, the body just has a way of expressing itself, not always related to what I do or don't do right. And how, that, is a way of understanding the impersonal nature of things too. So this acknowledgement, Namo Tassa Bhagavato, is just saying, hey, these teachings came from somewhere, and we're honoring that. They came from the Buddha, they were passed down. People who really cared deeply and remembered that they cared about intentionality again and again and again, talk to each other and remember these teachings by chanting often for, hundreds of years. And then here we are, the beneficiaries of all that intentionality. So we're in a lineage with other people who are other suffering, deluded beings just like us, right? Who care about waking up and learning something incrementally, slowly over time. And these teachings arose in India and in Asia and in Buddhist cultures. And so it's good to remember that an American didn't create these teachings, and we can be served to remember that as often as we possibly can, right? And give some honor and regard and appreciation to our Asian ancestors. So in Buddhism, onto the refuges now. And in Buddhism, it's good to remember that we're interested in an internal cultivation. So the Buddha was exclusively interested in how the internal shapes the external, right? So we often have questions about how things came to be in the external world. And, this is one orientation, that all of what we feel, all the internal mind states and our thoughts and our intentions and our actions then shape everything that we see, shape our relationships and our communities and our structures and our systems and the social world that we live in, right? So if we want to know how to impact change in the external, then we look inside. We get really good at listening to the heart and seeing how suffering is created, what leads to the end of suffering, and what tends to support harmonious living. And then we continue to do what feels useful and beneficial, not to ourselves, but to ourselves and our communities. So we want to see if we can purify our intentions and observe how our lives work when we care deeply about presence and about wisdom and ethical living. Is it better? Is it worse? Right? When we remember what we value, do our lives work better or do they work not so good? Right? That's for us to check out. There's a Tanisaro Bhikkhu who has done a lot of translation, and he's a monk. He says, when a practitioner takes refuge, it's essentially an act of taking refuge in the dark doctrine of karma, which we might say is like cause and effect. So when we go for refuge or when we take refuge, it's like a deep honoring of how things unfold, right? That it's not a mistake, things unfold like this, right? It's just cause and effect. When the sun comes out, the earth is warmed, right? Or our bodies are warmed. Or when it rains, it waters things that need watering and they grow, right? It's just simple like this. When our minds are full of reactive tendencies, and it tends to create havoc in our lives. But when we train our hearts and minds to be skillful and to cultivate beneficial tendencies like love and compassion and patience, then that tends to fall out of us too, right? And it tends to have a beneficial impact on our lives and on the world. And so taking refuge is really orienting in something that is going to help us, right? And it's going to be a support. And in fact, it remembers, taking refuge is like remembering the deepest thing, the deepest, most beneficial thing to guide our lives. And we take false refuge all the time, right? So those are our natural habits, to forget the deepest thing or try to make ourselves feel better momentarily. And although there's nothing wrong with enjoying life, right? If we're only reliant on chasing the next pleasant experience, then we're going to be disappointed. And this is what we learn. This is like a human predicament, a human trap, right? We're always chasing the next thing that feels good and trying to avoid everything that doesn't feel good. And then at some point we wake up and go, God, this is, what am I doing here? And that's the kind of suffering that often brings us to practice, to seek the deepest thing. So taking refuge in the Buddha, this Buddham Saranam Gacchami, right? And then Dhammam Saranam Gacchami, Sangham Saranam Gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And then we add that a word in the second stanza, that Dutiyampi, that just means for the second time. And then in the third stanza, Tatiyampi, and that just means for the third time. So we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha once, twice, three times. And those are the refuges. And this word Buddham is a key word in taking refuge in the Buddha. And the root word is bodhi, and it just means wakefulness or to be awake, right? So when we take refuge in the Buddha, we're remembering this capacity that we all have to be awake, right? To be here for our lives, to be intimate or sensitive, to be mindful or aware, like all words that we might use interchangeably. And so Buddha, taking refuge in the Buddha, is like, oh yeah, there is this capacity that we all have as human beings to be intimate in our lives. And taking refuge in the Dhamma, Buddha knows Dhamma. So to be awake to the way it is. Dhamma is a way of saying the way it is. Oh, it's like this. So we're learning to get real. So we have this capacity to be real, and to be real in the deepest ways, right? Like these ways that aren't the most obvious to us. Like, wow, everything is in motion. That's hard to see, right? We can see some things remind us of that, like the seasons are changing, always changing, not just changing in 1 week, but always in a state of motion, right? And we can sometimes see, like in a different way, like looking at being in tune with our bodies, like, wow, our bodies are always changing. And when we see sensations, we see, oh, well, they're in motion too, right? Tingling is not tingling forever. Heat is not heat forever. Things like this. So Buddha knows Dhamma the way it is. And knowing Dhamma is a way of remembering that we don't have to be lost in hopelessness or fear all the time, but we can learn to deal with our lives as it is. We might see ourselves falling into these ends of like, wow, things suck for me, or I think my life is hard and I feel this way about it, or I feel that way about it. But at some point, even when these traps arise in the mind, we can learn how to go like, oh yeah, but this is just the way it is, right? I don't have to be so afraid. I just like have to be real, like, and feel this, and trust that when I can feel this and learn how to set down those mind traps of feeling hopelessness and fearful, that life becomes a little more tolerable, right? Because I'm not in contention with reality. Right? So it's not like Buddhists are just into suffering all the time. We're just into being real, right? And honoring, acknowledging like, oh, it's really like this, right? The world is really like this. The human beings are really like this. I am really like this, right? These habits of mind sweep me off my feet and I get reactive. It's humbling when we see that, but it's true. And so seeing the way it is like being radically honest with ourselves. And then taking refuge in Sangha is, in a way, it can be like the Dhamma expressing itself. Some of you were here for the celebration that we had, was it 2 weeks ago now? Or last week? Just last week. Look at that. And it was such a beautiful time together, even if you weren't here. You might recognize that for some of the pictures that you saw in the weekly email, or just hearing about it like this. And one of the things that feels so lovely about spiritual communities is that we really try when we're here, right? We really try to show up and be our best selves. And it may not last forever. It may not even last through the car ride home, right? But it is a beautiful seed that we plant that has taken some root, right? When we plant a seed like that to show up and be our best selves, then it has an impact on our heart. It feels good. And it feels good not just to ourselves, but to each other. So taking refuge in Sangha could be a way of, can be a way of seeing like, oh, this intentionality then expresses itself in my heart and has an impact in the communities that I'm a part of, just like that. And it can be a way of acknowledging our teachers too, and honoring our teachers, like, oh, thank goodness we have people who know something about some Dhamma, about Buddhism, about practice, to be able to share with us, right? And we can be teachers for each other in that way. And we can, the Buddha said it was wise for us to emulate each other when we see that goodness coming out of ourselves. And so we can be on the lookout for just the beautiful qualities of heart and mind that express themselves in our communities, our families, ourselves, right? So that we can recognize these as moments of beauty, but moments of freedom where the heart is not encumbered by any of the defilements or hindrances or expressions of greed, hatred, and delusion. Like in a moment, the heart knows how to be good, right? And it's good for us to remember that potential rests in ourselves as well as in other people. Taking refuge in Sangha. And I'm really realizing at this pace, I'm never even going to get to the precepts. So I'll skip around a little bit. There's this little poem in the Dhammapada. I'll read it. They go to many a refuge, to mountains, forests, parks, trees, and shrines. People threatened with danger. That's not the secure refuge. That's not the highest refuge. That's not the refuge, having gone to which you gain release from all suffering and stress. But when, having gone for refuge to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, you see with right discernment the Four Noble Truths: stress, the cause of stress, the transcending of stress, and the Noble Eightfold Path, the way to stilling of stress. That's the secure refuge. That's the highest refuge. That is the refuge, having gone to which you gain release from all suffering and stress. Okay. So going to refuge is taking this teaching of the Four Noble Truths into our hearts. And the Four Noble Truths in a nutshell is this, what the Buddha discovered when he watched his mind, right? With this question in mind, like, what is suffering? And, how do we know the end to that? Right? What is suffering and the end of suffering? Well, the Four Noble Truths, that suffering is this like pragmatic experience, right? That we can't get away from, but we can learn to understand. And the cause of suffering is craving, right? So craving should be abandoned. When we can learn to abandon craving, then the third noble truth is we can experience freedom. And how do we do that? Well, the Buddha laid out this eightfold path, these 8 factors that help us do that. So taking refuge is taking refuge in this path that's in front of us, that's available to us to really know freedom. And we may not know how to do it, but I always think of like taking refuge as renewing an interest or like a sense of wonder about it. Right? God, I don't know how to do this. And every moment, if I'm skillful, like a percentage of my life, that's great. And if I can remember to be in wonder about how suffering comes to be and understand it a little bit, and the heart learns how to set down some of its craving in many moments, that's a wonderful thing, right? Just to be in wonder and keep the possibility of freedom in mind, the deepest freedom in mind. So on to the precepts now. And 10 minutes or less. And like I said before, we bring the precepts to mind because we want to rely on something, right? Some kind of framework to guide our lives. And these are just some basic trainings that we can take up. Santi Caro, a wonderful teacher who's been here quite a lot, lives in Wisconsin. He calls these training wheels, right? They're just the beginning for us. And when we really dig into them, we can see how really complex it is and how just taking up the training leads us to a whole lot of inquiry, because we're going to find like, wait a second, is this what that, like, these are oriented around non-harming. Well, does that mean what kind of non-harming, right? Is it okay to do this and not that? What do I do with ants or fruit flies? Or, is it okay to like talk sternly to my child? Or, what do we do here? What about, all kinds of things. So the precepts come out of the second group of path factors in the Noble Eightfold Path, and this is the ethics part of the path. And the ethics part of the path gets a third of the whole path, so it's not a small thing, right? We tend to prioritize this mind cultivation that we do when we're sitting here, but if we think about how to live and we only sit, then, just by getting a very small slice of what the Buddha has to offer for us, right? So how we live and go about and realize our interconnectedness and try to be skillful human beings, that's a huge part of Buddhist practice. So in this part of the path where the precepts come out of, wise speech, wise action, and wise livelihood. Right? And what makes it wise? Like, instead of just good speech or speech that I prefer, right? Like, wise speech recognizes the influence of the whole path, right? All of the path factors, from wise view and wise intention, the ethics, and then the cultivation of wise effort and wise mindfulness and wise concentration or continuity of awareness. So in a single path factor, all of the other factors of the path are also embedded there, which means that like the path is meant to extend throughout our entire lives. Anything that human beings could do solo or connected, right? The path has something for us and everywhere. And so it's fully integrated. Each path factor is fully integrated, right, with the other path factors and available to us in all of our lives. So wise speech, right? Wise speech wise speech follows wise intention. So when we care about our intentions, then we can recognize them, then it supports how we go about living and acting, right? What we say is influenced by what we intend, right? We might think like I'm going to say this thing that sounds really nice, or no, we might not even think about that. We might just say this thing that sounds really nice and then look back and go like, oh, I was just being kind of fake, right? Because my intentions were just to be done with the conversation, right? So when we're practicing, we're learning how to recognize that, right? And then our speech and our actions and the way we live and the work we do all are contributed, right? And so we can remember that without taking care of our actions and our ethical, the way we live, then it's hard for the mind to settle. So this third aspect of the path, which is about mind cultivation, is directly related to how we've been living. Because once we sit down, once we sit down and close our eyes, we're going to be flooded with the impact of our bad behavior, right? And this has hopefully happened to all of us. It certainly has happened to me, right? Like I sit down and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be calm now. And I just remember the last argument I got into with my partner and how I said all the wrong things, right? And that's an example of like, okay, the way we live definitely impacts how how our minds are able to settle. And so the Buddha called, this, he used the term that like the bliss of blamelessness, right? To talk about what that's like, how the mind can actually settle when we don't have the burden of our bad behavior as the last taste in our minds. So I'll go through these 5 training precepts really quickly. And it's nice. I like to use the Pali because it reminds me of this lineage and history that we have, that we're all swimming in. It reminds me that it's not just me or this one moment or my few teachers, right? It reminds me of this Asian history and lineage and all the way back to the time of the Buddha. And for me, it feels comforting to go like, oh yeah, God, suffering human beings, deluded, people who make all kinds of mistakes, just like me, have been on this path and kept renewing their investment and living in a good, intentional way. And I'm doing that too right now. So I'm in good company, and I've been in good company for hundreds of years. So the first one is Panatipata, and that is around, and the English is, I undertake the training to refrain from harming living beings. So all of the precepts are around non-harming, but this one in particular is around not killing or not hurting other beings, right? And so we get to look at the rub of non-harming right here, and an exploration of how our lives work and how much we rely on hatred and ill will to guide our lives. Like if we're being real, if we're being honest, we get to practice looking at that squarely so that we're not kidding ourselves, right? And then the second one, Adina Dana, is about not stealing. So I undertake the training to refrain from taking that which is not given. So it's a training in living and practicing, in some ways we might say it's a training in generosity, right? Being generous, being willing to give, and being willing to receive freely. And there's so many ways, like I said, that these trainings will transcend everything that we do. So we can think about, sometimes I'll think about this precept when I'm working. What does it mean to just give myself over to these tasks that I don't want to do necessarily, even at Common Ground, right? Emails aren't always that fun, right? But I do, like, I want the person who's written an email to feel a personal connection. I don't want to be rushed when I'm writing that, so that I can feel the possibility of goodness expressing itself even in this one moment. I want to walk through the building and feel like, oh, people are here. I care about getting the cobwebs down, or the building really needs a little attention right now. So I've been noticing that this morning. Maybe a good sweep or a good vacuum, right? I care about that. So I want to, when I'm here, when I'm working, just give myself over to the work and not rushing through it. That's a way of being generous, right? And then also to receive, to receive my livelihood, to receive the impact of other people flowing through my workplace, and all of the hard work that people are doing. That could be a way of receiving generously as well. Parenting can be like this, right? And being in our family systems can be like this. How am I allow myself to be fully exposed and present here? And how do I allow myself to receive the truth of what the system is like? And then this third one, Kame Sumi Chachara, is about refraining. I undertake the training to refrain from sexual misconduct. So for me, this really invites us into an exploration of power and how we can misuse power, right? Or how we can use power skillfully, right? And acting out our sexual instincts, like how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that's mature, right? So it's not about that we can't be sexual beings. That's not what this one is about. It's just that we're being honest about the forces of energies that flow through our bodies and our hearts. And we're not denying that. And we're just agreeing to train to use them skillfully, right? And we can use our sexual energy skillfully when we can learn to acknowledge it, right? And learn to take care of ourselves and each other. And then the fourth one, musawada. I think of my teacher sometimes she'll go, musawada, right? It's about speech. So I undertake the training to refrain from harmful speech. And defined, harmful speech is defined in 4 ways. So using speech as a weapon or slanderous speech, harsh speech, speech that's just sarcastic or unkind, not careful, not full of care, straight up lying, omitting the truth, and then idle speech, such as just talking to fill space because we're uncomfortable. And sometimes I see this like in the look in my partner's face when I'm going on and on, like, oh, I'm taking up her time that wasn't given freely, and here I am just going on and on. Let me see if I can show some restraint here. And then the 5th one, Sura Mariya Majapamadatana. And this is to undertake the training to refrain from intoxicating drinks and drugs that lead to carelessness. So it doesn't mean that we can't take our medication, or that we don't use caffeine, or even that we can't have a glass of wine if we want to do that. It just means that we're full of care and we're watching how that leads to carelessness in the mind, right? And we all have to find our own way with this and do the training, right, in a way that makes sense in our lives. But we're really committing to watching so that we can see when our behavior is shifted because of what we've taken in. And media can be included here too, right? Anytime that are we obsessing about media, and how does that influence how we live and how we interact with each other? And there's lots of other things too. But for now, we're out of time. So we're not going to chant the refuges and precepts, but there are lots of recorded chants on Dharma Seed. So if you go there and listen to another teacher chant them, you could follow along. And there's access to the chant book online or here at Common Ground. And perhaps at another occasion, we'll chant it together. All right, thanks everyone for being here. I know that Lucy's here online, and I'll pass it over, but thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you, Shelly. Will you be making me host or co-host? I hope.